Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Adnan Zuberi, and I'm with the Science for Peace Student Club that organized this special talk as part of Science for Peace's Vital Discussions on Human Security monthly lecture series. I want to thank all of you for coming here today. Many of you might remember that this talk was actually originally scheduled for February 6th, but had to be canceled, and the whole university had to be shut down because our beloved Weather Channel informed us of freezing ice rain. But nevertheless, here we are, and we've reassembled and got our energies back to make this talk happen. So based here at the University of Toronto, Science for Peace is an organization that consists of experts and the wider public that seek to understand and act on matters of militarism, social injustice, and environmental destruction. There were many notable academic scientists here at U of T that saw the Cold War and the number of nuclear weapons getting out of control and realized that they had to step in and bring scientific reasonability, reasoning and sensibility to de-escalate matters. And the timing of this talk couldn't be more important given that we're stepping into potentially a new and more dangerous Cold War. I would like to thank the very people who made this evening possible. This includes Sean Roberts, the esteemed science journalist, and our brilliant chemistry postdoc, CU Go, and our hardworking and dedicated Science for Peace volunteer team. Also, I would like to thank the very organizations that were of enormous help. This includes Science at Macy, the Ethics Society and Law program here at Trinity College, the Social Justice Studies Department at OISE, and the Arts and Science Student Union as well. Today's program is as follows. Professor Polanyi will be speaking for roughly 40 to 45 minutes, followed by a discussion period, taking the evening to about maybe ending just before 6:15. I met many wonderful people during the course of organizing this event, and nothing could mean more than having the encouragements come from one of the nation's top scientists and in wanting to see this talk happen. And in this regard, the distinguished Earth Sciences professor, Barbara Sherwood-Lawler, is one that certainly stands out, and I couldn't be more honored than to have her introduce Professor Polanyi. Please welcome Professor Lawler.
Thank you. I'm actually a bit of a fraud standing before you here tonight. This was, of course, to have been an introduction done by Professor Richard Sandbrook, who was unfortunately called away. He's the vice president of the Science for Peace group on campus, but was called away because of a funeral. And so I was asked if I would step in. Happy to do that. It's always, though, very, very difficult to step in and give an introduction for a man who needs no introduction. Of course, Dr. John Polanyi, our treasure here at the University of Toronto in Canada, Nobel Laureate for his own incredible research, and, of course, as the Canadian founder of the Canadian Pugwash, in that sense, then, too, a sharer in the Nobel Prize for Peace that the Pugwash movement received. We know him personally as younger faculty members here at U of T as an incredibly gracious and supportive colleague, particularly for those of us who are younger and stumbling along in his large footprints. He is always a source of support and comes out whenever one has a need or a call. And that is an accomplishment in and of itself, although minor compared to, of course, the other myriad things for which he's known as an advocate for nuclear arms control, as a voice for the support for fundamental science, and as, of course, always a conscience for the idea of how scientists and engineers can act with and in support of society to move us forward on the kinds of goals and enormous challenges that are facing us. John is, of course, a companion of the Order of Canada, and if you're aware of that, the wording for the Order of Canada is they desire a better country. And what I think of John, what I think is one must be very careful about giving Dr. John Polanyi the mandate to desire a better country, because you better get out of the way while he makes that happen or join. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, both Adnan Zuberi, the first speaker, who really has twice made this happen. First time there was freezing rain, and I said, desist, the gods have spoken, they don't want it. And but a lot of you people who helped in organizing this persisted, and I do so much value that. And thank you, Professor Barbara Lollar, for those charming comments. As you understand, she stepped in at the last moment. We shall miss Richard Sandbrook, however, because his field is strategic studies, and I was going to pass on the questions to him, but too late. Just a word about the place we're meeting. George Ignatieff, it's named after, and George Ignatieff was a friend of yours and a friend of mine, and he was the late George Ignatieff. He was a Russian aristocrat, then a Canadian lumberjack, and then our ambassador to the Geneva disarmament talks. And a lovely man. And actually, I was busy in the Globe and Mail, also represented here tonight, more than once perhaps. I was busy attacking the conference on disarmament, and then I met George Ignatieff, and I thought he's going to spit at me, instead of which he embraced me, half killing me. He said, keep it up, more. So enough of introduction. Well, almost enough. You do understand that when we planned this, and I didn't plan it, I'm the victim of the Science for Peace and Massey College and others who planned it. We didn't have an election, so this isn't an election meeting. It's, but we can talk about the sad fact that arms control is not being mentioned in the debate about the election. That's very bad. Somebody who had something relevant to say, I was just going to quote, and that is a visitor in the last couple of days to Canada, and before that a speaker at the General Assembly of the UN, and her name is, somewhere here, Greta Thunberg. And she's a 16-year-old Swedish girl, and what she said to the UN General Assembly could just as well be said about the arms race and nuclear weapons. So I thought I would quote her. She's pretty strong when she speaks, and that's impressive. She said to the General Assembly, "You come to young people for hope. I do too. You say you understand the urgency. How dare you pretend that this," in her case it was climate change, but there's a blending between climate change and our topic this evening. "You pretend that this can be solved by business as usual. Change is coming," she closed, "whether you like it or not." So all this that Greta had to say, I see as being true of the gravest danger we face, which is a nuclear war. So what are we supposed to do to counter nuclear war? That's the catchy title, and it is a catchy title, even though we are all focused on climate change. Adnan Zuberi, our super organizer, has, I think, 8,000 people on Facebook watching this, and so I say hello to those 8,000. They're actually seeing something if they're there, and I hope they'll excuse me. I'm very bad at names, so I may forget a few of the 8,000. But what I was going to say is, what's the core of the remarks I'm going to give? And I can put it very briefly. The world, and it's the world we're thinking of, needs to take two unmistakable steps back from the brink of nuclear war. And the first step, you could guess, it is disarmament, which at the moment is decaying at a rapid rate instead of being increased, which it should be. So first step is disarmament, and the second step will sound to you like a fantasy, but it is a total ban on the possession of nuclear weapons. And I will try to defend the position that that is not pie in the sky, it's an inevitable second step. Well, the way in which I organized this was a bit personal. I began by the power in my mind, as I was preparing the notes, the power of new ideas. And of course, I had in mind scientific ideas. I still have a lab. I'm just looking to see whether the occupants of this lab are here. Put up your hands. Are you here? Apparently not. Oh, yes! But you see, I can't see your face because it's hidden. And so I have an intense interest in science, and I would put the date that the new age, the nuclear age, started as being easy to pinpoint. It started actually in Montreal at McGill with Rutherford's work, which is easy to remember the date because it was 1900. And then you can follow, and we have the new principal of Massey College here in the audience. In fact, I'm sure there are lots of friends here in the audience. You can follow this history by going to the, I call it the private dining room, the little dining room upstairs in Massey College. It sounds incredible, but there you will find a telegram yellowing, and that telegram, which I gave to Robertson Davies, the first master of Massey College, that telegram is one in which a guy called Leo Szilard, who was the scientist who thought of the nuclear chain reaction and actually patented it in 1935, and he realized how dangerous it was, and he tried to think of some organization that was more or less respectable he could donate it to, and he liked the cut of the British Navy's uniform. So he assigned the patent for the nuclear age to the Royal Navy, and none of this is made up. This is all historic fact. Well, he visited, this sounds like more fantasy, he visited my father in Manchester. That's where I was brought up, and that's where I went to the university. But at this point, I was a few years old, so this is earlier, 1935. And he came and he sat in the garden of our house, and you'll see on the telegram the name of our house, Kenmore, Didsbury Park, Manchester. And the reason for the telegram was he'd been sitting in the garden calculating the temperature that would be reached in a nuclear explosion. And the telegram, I don't know if I have something to guide me. I'll just have to remember it. The telegram says to my father, the recipient of the telegram, I could read, but barely. I can read now. The telegram says, we miscalculated the temperature by taking 4 instead of 10 to the power 4 as the exponent of E, an easy mistake to make. And the telegram goes on, clearly the temperature that would be reached from a nuclear chain reaction would be thousands of millions of degrees centigrade. That was sent in 1935. 10 years later, incredible, the mad pace of history, 10 years later, 1945, was the year that the first atomic bomb was used in war, dropped on Hiroshima and a few days later on Nagasaki. So, we should be ready for science in this century to move at a rapid pace, and we should use our imagination in preparing ourselves for that. We have to believe in change, and people will tell you, but you can't change human nature, but you can change human behavior, and that's the thing we have to do. Actually, my example of that is if somebody were to light a cigarette in this audience, you'd quickly see that human behavior has changed since I arrived at this university. That would not be allowed. Well, so we're in 1945, and I'm going to give you a bit of history because this is, you're seeing a Stone Age man. You're seeing somebody who happened to be born as a new age was emerging, the nuclear age. And so it's worth thinking about that history a bit. And it was in 1945 in Chicago that they prepared materials which would then become the first atomic bomb. And the scientists involved, one of them was the guy who sent that telegram, Leo Szilard, amazing guy, and for what it's worth, an influence on me and somebody I admired enormously. And he got together with a Nobel Prize winner called James Franck, and they wrote a statement warning the world about nuclear weapons. And you have to understand that if they had breathed a word that could be heard by the general public, they would have been tried for treason. So this was a secret document, and what did it say? I'll quote from it. Unless an effective international control is instituted, a race for nuclear armaments is certain to ensue following the first revelation of our possession of a nuclear weapon. Well, they were right. And 70 years later, which is now, we are still in the midst of that arms race. And, they were also right in thinking that such an arms race is not likely to just end spontaneously, unless it ends disastrously, of course, in which case it will end. But what we hope for and what brings us together this evening is that we can end it by law. And I've mentioned two types of law. Control of armaments, that's one type of law, and it's existed and indeed still exists, but it's getting ragged at the edges. And another type of law which would say that instruments of mass destruction are not something that you're allowed to have, even though you are all law-abiding citizens and are entitled to carry guns, not nuclear weapons. Well, the notion that law should be sort of in charge of war is not a new one. It's as old as war. People have dreamt that law would intervene. What's new today is not that people talk about law restricting war. What's new is the scale on which we can kill. And that too, I, a Stone Age man, am old enough to think about the years when that dawned on people. My parents were living in Manchester. I was living on and off in Manchester. And at night time, you heard the drone of aeroplanes, thousands of them, going to drop their bombs on Germany. Well, gradually people came around to the view that this wasn't a proper way for human beings to behave. And today, plans for war can only with difficulty be distinguished from plans for something that is actually proscribed by law, namely genocide, killing people at large. So, in this short history, we've got human beings at a moral divide, and that's where we sit. And what our job is, and you're doing it by coming here tonight, but you can't stop when I end. Our task is to keep that process of education going. And it's a noble task, and you should actually rejoice that you happen to have been born when that burden is placed on you, that obligation. It's a task of education, and we meet in an institution devoted to education. So we should rejoice that we were born at this time and have that noble task ahead of us. It doesn't matter whether you rejoice or not, it's still your task. Well, a bit more personal history perhaps. When I was at Princeton, the next stage of this story was unfolding. I arrived in Princeton 1954, and just then the talk, though subdued because it was secret, but nonetheless the talk, was about another weapon which would be as much more powerful than the atomic bomb as the atomic bomb was than conventional explosives. And that weapon was going to be the hydrogen bomb, which operates on the basis of fusing hydrogen atoms. And the result is a further factor of 1,000 in power per unit of weight than an atomic bomb. Well, the word got around. It was secret again, top secret, but the word got around in Princeton, and that was, I said it was 1954. That's very close. And that same year, President Truman, who was the president, and distinctly more sane than the present one, determined nonetheless to proceed with the hydrogen bomb. And this was despite the fact that he had a scientific advisory committee which virtually unanimously opposed that development. And it's also interesting, important, memorable that the opposition of that panel of scientists, which was virtually unanimous to development of the H-bomb, wasn't based on technical grounds. It was based on moral grounds. And I had a friend, Hans Bethe, B-E-T-H-E, who managed to get an article on this subject into the Scientific American. What year was it published? It was published in 1950, before Truman had made the decision. And Hans wanted to be sure it was published. How he got it into the Scientific American, I don't know, without being tried for treason. But this is what he said in that Scientific American article, early 1950 now. Can we, he meant the US, who insist on morality and humanity, introduce this weapon of total annihilation into the world? Shall we convince the Russians, who were the only possible opponent at that time, of the value of the individual by killing millions, So there it was in the pages of the Scientific American. And not a single H-bomb existed at that time. And this time there was a bit of debate, though it was sotto voce. And we're still trying to absorb the truth of what Hans Bethe said, that we shouldn't have anything to do with such a weapon. You might well ask what the heck was going on in Truman's mind. Well, he was impelled by the logic of the arms race. The Soviet Union, as it then was, had just tested its first A-bomb, and they were designing an H-bomb. And the US, having itself been the first to make an A-bomb, that was in 1945, as I told you, it seemed imperative to be the first to make an H-bomb. And so they were. Actually, they more or less had one operating in 1952. That was middle of my time in Princeton. But this advantage that they got was short-lived. It lasted for 2 years before the Soviet Union had its hydrogen bomb, and now there are thousands of hydrogen bombs. Well, you should go on questioning, how could nations be persuaded to engage in such folly? And the most prominent reason was one that still operates. They wanted to keep ahead of their opponents. And of course, each one leaves a little margin for safety. And so the competition is without end. And for the second time, the scientific community, second time in the space of a few years, scientific community was being asked to come to a judgment on something that was beyond their expertise, but of great importance to them and to the world. It would have been much saner to negotiate an agreement of mutual restraint with the single nuclear power that existed at that time, Russia. And the option was discussed. But because there wasn't an audience like this one, which would have made all the difference, the public voice just was faint. It's not surprising. It was a secret. So I've touched on the responsibility of the scientists to raise an alarm. They sort of started then, and you heard about this in the introduction. I was early on part of the Pugwash movement, which actually has Canadian roots. Pugwash is a village in Nova Scotia. And Cyrus Eaton, a wealthy Canadian-American, said he would host meetings of scientists. And the first big one with the Russians was held in 1960 in Moscow. And because people who should have gone, who were far more likely to be of influence than I, were leery of being seen in Moscow, I had the good fortune to attend in 1960. And it was a friendly encounter at the musty Hotel Metropole in Moscow. And the suggestion there made was, if we have to have this bloody weapon, we should have the absolute minimum. And it would be somebody like Leo Szilard, my hero, who then piped up and said, yes, one under Moscow, one under Washington, but no more. Well, I actually was young enough that I went up to him and said, were you joking? And of course he didn't answer. He was too clever for that. And he was sort of half joking, but only half. It was a perfectly reasonable suggestion. provided, even that, only provided that you go from one on each side to none. Well, I'm going to skip the further discussion that we had about verification. You can imagine how offended our hosts were when we suggested they might be lying. Let's skip that. But let me just tell you the fact that far from keeping the number of weapons at that minimum level or anywhere near it, the number escalated to 30,000 in America and 30,000 in Russia. That meant, the documents are now freely available, that there were 400 nuclear weapons assigned to attack Moscow. So that was just to destroy Moscow 100 times over, just for safety. Well, it's heartening that this madness was followed by a period of restraint. We're now up to 1990, I would say. And in fact, we come to a real live arms control agreement. 2011, the START agreement, which is now called New START. And that limits the number of nuclear weapons that either of the two superpowers can have. They have 90% of all the weapons in the world. But the other holders of weapons are important too. We'll get to them. Well, this New START agreement involves very much of on-site inspection. They climb up these missiles and with a screwdriver and see what's on top. The New START agreement lapses in 2021. You'll be glad we're getting to dates that are a little more familiar to you. And it's in urgent need of renewal. But I haven't seen any reports of anybody meeting to discuss renewal. Rather the contrary, when John Bolton was around. Well, what's going on here? Has reason sort of died? No. There is a feeling of restraint on which you and I should build. And that feeling that our future depends on restraint is based on some close calls, and you can find bookfuls describing them. I'm only going to describe one. You know about it, but I think you should be reminded of it, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It came 2 years after that meeting with all the vodka and caviar at the Hotel Metropole in Moscow. 2 years later, for 13 days, the world was at the brink of all-out nuclear war. That's how fast things move. What happened was that Khrushchev secretly shipped nuclear weapons to Cuba. Kennedy responded with a speech on television in which it was the first time that anybody had heard of this because it was top secret, and he announced it. And he said that if a single missile is fired from Cuba, we are going to launch full-scale retaliation against the Soviet Union. That meant unrestricted nuclear war and the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. So, what you hear about occasionally in asides in people's scary articles was actually fully on stage. Civilization or civilizations were at risk, and very much so. So, just to make it real, we stopped work in the lab. Liddy, who put up her hand, and is here from the lab will be amazed that we ever stopped. Well, we did. It just didn't seem worthwhile doing anything. And because of that visit that I'd made so cordially 2 years earlier to Moscow, the CBC, also represented here tonight, invited me to give a talk in those fraught 13 days, about 3 days or 4 days in. And I had a manuscript. And I showed it to I guess he's called the producer, the guy who greeted me. And he glanced through it and he said, well, I'm glad you're giving this talk, not me. Because what I was going to say was inflammatory. And I knew it was. I didn't know quite how much, but it was. I was going to point out, and I did, that the world had not been transformed by Khrushchev's action. We in the West had been totally vulnerable to nuclear attack and remain so, now in addition from Cuba. But a colossal deterrent existed in the opposite direction. The US Air Force had planes flying all the time loaded with nuclear weapons and aimed at the USSR. And my point of my talk was that it would be reckless to invade Cuba to get rid of those weapons because we'd start something we didn't know how to stop. I didn't make any friends, or at least actually I did eventually, but not at that moment. This was not what people wanted to hear, and it was not, in fact, the whole story. Khrushchev had, after all, secretly shipped these nuclear missiles, and he thought he had a good reason for it, and he was thinking in mathematical terms. He was thinking the year before, Kennedy had placed very similar missiles in Turkey that were a few minutes away from Moscow. So mathematically, there was no difference. Well, it turned out that, and I say this for my greatly admired friend Adnan Zuberi, who caused this meeting to occur more than any single person. He's a mathematician. Politics is not, it turns out, mathematics. Had Kennedy not responded forcefully to Khrushchev, he would have been seen to be weak, tempting Khrushchev to take still greater risks than he already had, probably in Berlin, where there was a tense confrontation. Well, you know, this should have been an easy case. Both sides knew what was at stake. Both the leaders were sane. Both were extremely anxious to avoid war, and yet war kept on creeping closer. The defensive moves that Kennedy authorized, and Kennedy was very careful, seemed to imply that he was ready to go to war with nuclear weapons against Russia. Submarines turned up, and Kennedy didn't know that they had nuclear weapons on. They were Russian submarines, and they were forced to the surface. And at that point, nuclear weapons were confronting nuclear weapons. And Kennedy was under huge pressure from people who I later met, who were in his Situation Room in the White House, to attack. I mean, what could be easier than Cuba, right there? What he didn't know was that the Cubans had been furnished with nuclear weapons. They weren't just on the way, they were there. And what he didn't know also, and I heard this from Robert McNamara, who was shaking for years later. He was the Secretary of Defense, so he was sitting next to Kennedy in the Situation Room. They had delegated the power to launch those missiles to the local commanders. So the situation was desperately dangerous, even though everybody was cautious in the extreme. Don't take too much comfort from that. Well, by the 13th day, it was clear that Khrushchev realized the danger, and he was eating humble pie. He was moving his missiles out of Cuba. Incidentally, that was the end of Khrushchev's career, which wasn't a trifling matter to him. Well, I guess I'm looking around. That was 2 years after that meeting in Moscow, so it was 1962. And some of you were not born in 1962, so let me mention a more recent event. Most of the people in the audience are over 2 years old, and there was a Korean missile crisis, and well, it was dangerous. Somehow, North Korea had made itself into a nuclear superpower, which means that it had a secure second strike capability. It did that by mounting nuclear weapons on trucks. So where were they? You couldn't destroy them at will. And now they have them in submarines as well. And so it was nukes against nukes again. You remember the dialogue, all options are on the table. That isn't lightly said. Well, the helplessness, really, of the most powerful nation on earth, the United States, in this confrontation is something that I haven't seen commented on as much as it should be. It was like the Cuban Missile Crisis. One side had to back down, or else there would be a nuclear war. Well, it was the US this time that backed down and recognized that North Korea, with its assured second strike capability, so you couldn't knock it out with the first strike, North Korea was a superpower, and there are now 9 such powers, all of which have the status of superpowers. I don't know if it will impress you, but the foreign minister of North Korea, in my view, wasn't bluffing when he said at the UN, the slightest miscalculation could have led to all-out war. It could. And there's a bit more that I want to add to this description, and that is the incredible power vested in Khrushchev, in this case, no, it wasn't Khrushchev, the power vested in it's really Trump versus Kim Jong-un. That's the pairing. Both of them, it doesn't matter that one was a dictatorship, another was a democracy and still is. Both of them had the power to initiate nuclear war. Now you might say, well, that's what it says on paper or something. In fact, they probably delegated it to some friend. Well, that's not very reassuring either. We have for far too long acceded to this preposterous situation where the power to end civilizations is vested in individuals, one of whom is rapidly going round the bend. But you check on me in a month from now. Well, you know, the lessons to be learnt are, first of all, the danger of nuclear war from miscalculation. But I think I should, for completeness, add that today we realize that in addition to the millions who would be killed in a nuclear war, millions more would die in subsequent years from famine because of the soot coming up from fires. That would last over a decade. And there's a further danger which has loomed. And what's happening is that, it all is allied to climate change, which many of you are rightly concerned about. Climate change says this is an awfully small planet we inhabit. What I'm saying is it's awfully small for fighting with weapons of this size. I was just saying that a modest nuclear war would result in a famine that killed many, many millions. But there's a further problem, and that is the miscommunication which entered into the other stories I told you, but now miscommunication can be deliberate and becomes itself a weapon. And we are fortunate to have a citizen lab under Ron Deibert, which is studying that, and Ron Deibert warns of an escalating arms race in cyberspace, and that compounds the risk of nuclear war. So we should take heart from the fact that we've managed to get through 70 years without any such war. And why is that? And most people challenged on it would say, well, it's because deterrence works. I'm not so sure. The equilibrium that is supposed to be present in deterrence doesn't seem to be actually working, because there is a race going on for dominance. There is a huge arms race going on now in numbers and mainly in kinds of weapons. So the question arises, what is the lack in deterrence? Why is it that the competition to get ahead in nuclear weapons is going strong and undermining what you may have supposed was an equilibrium? And I would give as the reason the following, that the parties who claim to be deterred, in fact, are not. They have yet to hear the voices that you have heard of Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, Mikhail Gorbachev, saying that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. They keep strategic, which means the weapons of mass destruction, strategic arsenals ready for launching in a matter of minutes. And the objective in this posture of launch on warning of some movement by the opponent is to allow a first strike to be made, to be followed by a protective missile defense of one's own territory. So the first strike doesn't have to be all-encompassing. So what are they actually planning for? They are planning to achieve the classic aim of war, which is victory, which is, of course, unachievable under conditions of mutually assured destruction. And that's what Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev were saying, and that lesson hasn't yet sunk in. There are other ways in which deterrence is being eroded. Small nuclear weapons are being designed. They always existed. Now they're being multiplied in number and in kind. They're called tactical weapons. Every exercise which used them came to the result that what was being protected by tactical nuclear weapons had actually been destroyed. So I return to the steps I mentioned at the outset. What we have to demand of our governments, and they can't, the government of Canada can't achieve it overnight, but they could be working towards it imaginatively. And whatever government it is, I'm afraid that there's no indication that that level of imagination and determination is there to disarm to a level where one could say, well, the residue actually is there as a deterrent. Robert Oppenheimer, you might be interested to be reminded, talked about the situation of deterrence. There is such a thing as deterrence. He talked about two scorpions in a bottle, each able to kill the other, but only at the cost of allowing itself to be killed. And going to a minimum deterrent, we shall, for a while, achieve that stability. And in fact, there is a country that has a minimum deterrent. It's China. China has about the 20th the number of nuclear weapons that the US has, a 20th the number that Russia has, and it separates the warheads from the missiles so that you can see from a satellite that this is a deterrent posture and not a preparation for an attack. China may be about to change that, but it's a very good situation at the moment and should be imitated. Well, there is a further step, and I have just time to mention it. You know, Winston Churchill dreamed that the minimum deterrent sort of situation might be enough. But most people who've been in the position of thinking about this, such as Obama when he gave a speech in Prague a few years ago, realize it's not a stable situation. And the what Winston Churchill said is that peace can be the sturdy child of terror. Well, I've spent a lot of your time and mine arguing that that child is not sturdy at all. And the risks are intolerable. And so we have to be prepared to think about going a step further. And in fact, there is an international agreement called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed 50 years ago by all the nuclear powers, with the exception of the recent ones, like North Korea, India, Pakistan, and which demands that they move steadily towards complete nuclear disarmament. They've been ignoring that. They have been arguing the impossible, which is that the original nuclear weapon states, their weapons are not actually a threat. They're on the side of peace. And that's an untenable assertion. What we have to do was spelled out in a move which was made 7th of July 2017, so finally I'm nearing the end of these remarks, at the United Nations General Assembly. An overwhelming majority of nations, actually 122 of the 190, voted to frame, it doesn't yet become law, to frame a global nuclear weapons prohibition treaty. It's called the NWPT. Once ratified by 50 countries, and it's been ratified by 25, it would prohibit nations from developing, testing nuclear weapons, possessing them, let alone using them, threatening to use them. Well, I think we should stop for a moment to think whether this is just a silly dream. It isn't at all. There is a nuclear weapons-free region which covers all of Latin America and has done for decades. But more important, and there is the NPT which demands this situation, but more important is the legislation that parallels it. The moral repugnance against indiscriminate slaughter that underlies international treaties banning chemical weapons, banning biological weapons, banning cluster bombs, banning anti-personnel mines. That was a Canadian initiative. There's something missing, and it's called nuclear weapons. Would a law accomplish anything? Yes. What laws do is they start a state of mind, a convention, as they started the state of mind which says that slavery is not to be countenanced, apartheid is not to be countenanced, genocide is not to be countenanced. They're all prohibited by law, which doesn't mean that nobody will ever offend against that law, but it means something, and it means something very important. It goes without saying that the present nuclear powers all scorn this notion that I'm presenting to you, and our government has said it's unrealistic and premature, and to which the answer is better premature than too late. As for unrealistic, we have to be willing to pass through some degree of unreality on the way to new realities that we want to produce. And I give you as an example the fact that Canada, which has been a member of a nuclear alliance as long as there have been nuclear weapons, we've been a member of a nuclear alliance, but we have refused to have any nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. And we take some justifiable pride in that protest against a reality which we see as being in need of change. Well, it's a sort of enslavement to weapons of mass destruction, which we have to discard through moral revulsion, and we can, and unless we do, we're in serious trouble. I'm going to end with a quote from President Kennedy. He left us with his reflections on what it is that unites us and should be able to take us to the destination that I'm just been spelling out. What he said in a speech which I think isn't as much quoted as it should be, we all inhabit this small planet, he said. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. So that realization could bring us to a more livable world. Thank you. You are going to have a chance to ask questions.
You still feel you have time for some questions?
Love it.
Can I open the floor for questions?
I should have told you at the beginning that you should be storing up devastating questions. Or comments.
Sego, I am Dahadinyo from Six Nations. I find it frustrating in today's world that the scientific knowledge is so unfortunately disregarded. And the only other knowledge that is more disregarded than scientific knowledge is the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples. The Haudenosaunee, from which community I came from, we had our great law of peace, and through that we abolished our weapons. I wish that more people would study our traditional knowledge and our motivations and our teachings, and perhaps one day even the institutions would have a land acknowledgement at the start of every organization such as this. Thank you.
Thank you. Lots of traditional knowledge in science. We, can't go around checking every scientist's work. We trust each other to have found bits of knowledge and we pass them on to each other, more or less as you describe it. Go ahead, but shout.
Good evening, Professor.
You're going to be given a microphone, which may help.
Yeah, thank you.
Ah,
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Athar. I'm from India. First of all, I absolutely loved your talk, so I had to mention that. My question is regarding your statement that we must disarm to a level where the residue is a deterrent. Could you please emphasize on that? How do we know how much disarmament is enough? Where do we decide? How do we decide that a certain amount of residue is deterring enough to prevent nuclear breakdown?
well, you could hear the question, could you? And I'm still wired up. I don't know if I'm still amplified. Yes, I am. So the question is, could we be fooled by some party which pretends to disarm and then suddenly says, I am the ruler of the world? I don't think that's likely, and it's a risk that I would happily take compared with the risks we are taking now. The fact is that inspection is pretty damn good. For decades, for almost, I don't know, 50 years, the New START agreement has relied on on-site intrusive inspection. And that's one of the reasons that that agreement is valuable. Partly, I'd rather have 1,500 weapons than 15,000. So that's a step in the right direction. But it's still an appalling and disgusting number. But what one gets as a bonus out of having such an agreement is a bunch of trusted, international, carefully vetted and trained inspectors who can challenge and go to a site that they choose and roam around. And the main, of course, that agreement, the New START agreement, is between the pair of countries which still have 90% of all the weapons, but they were the only possessors of these weapons at the time of the agreement. And both of them welcomed the fact that they were getting this window into what frightened them, which was their opponents' weapons. They maybe should be afraid of their own weapons, but mainly they're afraid of their opponents' weapons. So to be able to send a disinterested international team to go and inspect regularly and frequently was very valuable. And so you've picked on a question that I think has an answer, which is that inspection works.
Hi, I'm George from Brampton. Do you see, or what role do you see any defensive weapons? You see, let's say we got rid of all nuclear weapons. I can just see the military-industrial complex or the U.S. wanting to have some sort of defensive measures. Do you see some sort of network of, because they're going to say, well, it just takes one to get through?
Yes, there would be resistance to conventional disarmament, but having taken the step which is beyond anything history has known, which is to go from civilization-killing weapons to mere conventional weapons, that might suggest to those in charge of the conventional weapons that they could reduce those. Certainly they could control them. And you ask your question at a good time, because more or less today, Canada has signed a treaty, an international treaty, which will control the export of conventional weapons. So I think that example that you kindly concede as being possible, namely nuclear disarmament, would have a profound effect on conventional weapons as well.
Do you think that unilateral disarmament would be possible or advisable?
It would certainly be preferable to the situation we find ourselves in, and it's pretty much beyond imagining. There is a risk, I suppose, in every. There have been a number of important arms control agreements, and there have been people who say, well, we don't actually trust the other people. We may be engaging in unilateral disarmament without knowing it. Well, I go back to the fact that inspection does work, and we just lost an important nuclear weapons treaty called the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement, which banned a huge class of nuclear weapons of range 500 kilometers to 5,000 or something, huge bunch. And they were taken apart and destroyed. And you could raise the question, could somebody have cheated? Yes, somebody probably did. And the result was that the treaty disbanded. I think that wasn't the only reason. Within days, I think it was a senior person in the Trump administration announced that the United States was also going to build intermediate nuclear forces. And I don't think they made that plan up in one day or 1 week. So there was a mood to get rid of a major arms control agreement. The previous one that was terribly important was the anti-ballistic missile treaty. I had to go and try and sell this to Russian generals. And what I had to go and say to the Russian generals was, we're going to mutually give up something which is a protection against your missiles, and you're going to give up a protection against our missiles, and we'll both be safer. And they said, well, we see your argument, but do you really expect us to go, this was in Moscow, to the Kremlin and start arguing that defenses are illegal? I mean, defenses have been a good thing for centuries. And now, for decades, they have been loud proponents of a ban on ballistic missile defenses. Why? Because defenses lead to arms races. It starts with an arms race in shields and becomes a general arms race. So we had a marvelous agreement which said, in effect, it was between Moscow and Washington, it said, we're in a new world. We're all vulnerable, and we're going to admit it. And we're going to admit it by, actually, one protection was needed, was allowed. It was pointless. It was a ring of ABM anti-ballistic missiles around Washington and a ring of anti-ballistic missiles around Moscow. And they still are there, useless. But because you can fool them. You just send in a lot of chaff along with your missiles. So the fact is that there have been marvelous treaties to limit an arms race and an arms race in defensive missiles too. It's just that we haven't had the wisdom to stick with them.
Do you have time for more questions? I'm not sure what the timing is on the room.
I think would one more
Sorry,
be okay?
one more.
Sure.
So, what do you see Canada's role in preventing nuclear war? Is it by providing impartial investigators,
Yes.
drafting a new treaty?
Well, I mean, we start with a history of supporting arms control agreements. If you look, as a friend of mine has just done, at what's being said in two powerful parliamentary committees. One is the Foreign Affairs Committee and the other is the Defense Committee, both very salient to what we're talking about here. Both of them in the past 2 or 3 years have been passing bipartisan, this is not partisan at all, bipartisan resolutions saying if the world is to avoid a nuclear war, we have to have disarmament agreements. Canada has a history of favoring such agreements and trying to promote them. We should be talking loudly in favor of them. For example, we should be saying it's too dangerous to have tactical nuclear weapons distributed around Europe. I mean, if there is an argument, and it's a very weak one, for having tactical, which means Hiroshima-size or a tenth of Hiroshima-sized weapons dotted around, put them somewhere in the Western United States, and then eventually phase them out. But don't distribute them all over Europe, forward placed between the two protagonists, Russia and the United States. This is an argument that is eminently worth making. Is Canada to be heard making it? No. We would be somewhat in bad odor. We are members of NATO. We don't want to say, look, NATO, you're doing something dangerous and foolish here. Let's start arranging to end the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in half a dozen countries in Europe, all NATO countries. We are implicated, and we should be opposing it, but we're not. And that's not because we don't want to, but we're frightened of offending Big Brother. We've often offended Big Brother to the south, by the way. For example, when we were invited to join President Reagan's Star Wars, Prime Minister Mulroney thought about it and then phoned up the United States and said, well, it isn't on our list of priorities. In fact, it's a stupid thing to do and a dangerous thing to do to start a race in anti-missile defenses. And that's why we said no. We, I was recommending we say no as loudly as I possibly could. And people said to me, but the reprisals from the US, we will never get over it. We have got over it.
Thank you.
Thank you, John, for enlightening us on this important subject and for prescribing two very sensible steps that we as a society can take. And on that note, I would like to thank all of you and the volunteers again for making this a very lively and informative gathering and conversation. And I hope that this talk inspires a future generation of scientists of the caliber of Hans Bethe, Leo Szilard, and John Polanyi himself. So please stay tuned for more events by Science for Peace on this subject. Thank you, and have a great evening.